share. And, uh-oh. There it is. Okay, so everybody can see that?
Yes, it's up now.
Okay, great. Okay, well, I'd like to thank you all for inviting me to speak with you today. You know, it's a big honor for us to get any type of attention we can get for our project outside of the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, or, you know, outside of Texas for that matter. When Dave first contacted me, he asked me to talk to the group about our book, The Civil War on the Rio Grande. And so I'll get into talking about that in just a minute. But as Dave said, I am, well, I'm really the chief cook and bottle washer for the CHAPS program at UTRGV. I've been with this project or this program for over 10 years, since November of 2009. And we started our Rio Grande Valley Civil War Trail project in 2013. So this has been a long-running project that hopefully will be our never-ending project, and that'll be a good thing. So the initiators of the Rio Grande Valley Civil War Trail project were, or are, Dr. Russell Skowronek and Dr. Christopher Miller. Both are history professors at UTRGV down here in Edinburgh, Texas. You know, we're located at the tippy bottom of Texas and pretty much along the US-Mexico border. And so Russ and Chris had this great idea while sharing cocktails in 2013 that we were amidst the sesquicentennial observation of the US Civil War. And, you know, throughout their time in the Rio Grande Valley, they had a realization that, you know, there were events and there were people and there were battles and places that were here and still are here that were very important during the US Civil War. And so they felt that this would be a great project to embark on for the CHAPS program, because the CHAPS program at UTRGV, even though it's an acronym for the Community Historical Archaeology Project with Schools program, we are all about preserving regional history and making ourselves the go-to place for cultural heritage tourism. And a way to do that is to develop this Rio Grande Valley Civil War Trail. So the other person on this slide is Samantha Bernard, and at the time she was our graduate assistant. We sent her on a journey between the 200 miles between Laredo and the Gulf of Mexico, and had her do the initial research for the project and identify the locations, create some research about it, take all of the GPS markers, if you will, that we needed for the actual map, and, you know, got us started, got the ball rolling with this. So with regard to the book, The Civil War on the Rio Grande, 1846 to 1876, we created this book as a collection of essays, or an edited anthology, if you will, and brought together a team of people who in their own right were experts with their research about certain aspects that were important to events that occurred along the Rio Grande during the US Civil War. And we know, of course, that the US Civil War technically was between 1861 and 1865, but we wanted to broaden our research with regard to this subject to encompass the Mexican-American War and then Reconstruction, because there were things that were occurring prior to the US Civil War along the border and then after the Civil War that we felt were important to include in the research as a package. So that's why we have this 30-year span with regard to the title of our book. So if any of you already have the book and maybe have started reading it, you'll see that it is a collection of essays. And so I'm listing the contributors here, and instead of just giving you the rundown on each of them, you know, we can talk about that at the end if any of you have any questions. But this particular group of people really possesses some pretty special knowledge and research with regard to what we cover and what we deem important to talk about with regard to the US Civil War and the events that occurred along the Rio Grande. So some of you, or maybe all of you, have seen this documentary by Ken Burns. And this was really our motivation for, or the driving factor for us to want to put this project forward, because when you watch this documentary film by Ken Burns, you would imagine that absolutely nothing happened west of the Mississippi during the US Civil War. And especially nothing happened along the Rio Grande, along the US-Mexico border. And so our region has been largely ignored by these historians who are super adept in researching the events that occurred during this period of time. But we are really motivated to bring these events to life and to light so that folks would know really what kind of impact the events that occurred down here, or the business, the trade that was occurring down here along the international border, that actually helped fund the efforts east of the Mississippi. So I have a slide later on in the presentation that's going to give you some staggering numbers of dollar values, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. So here is a map that was created by Dr. Jerry Thompson. He's one of our scholars that has assisted us greatly with this project. And he's the Regent Professor of History at Texas A&M International University in Laredo, and he's published, I want to say, over 20 books in his career, and has won lots and lots of awards along the way. And so he created this map that showed the different battles and skirmishes that occurred along the Rio Grande that we do talk about throughout the books, throughout our books in various respects. And then the map on the right side of the screen is something that was published in a New York newspaper in 1863 that wanted to highlight the Union invasion into the region. So what we have is this area down here, close to the opening of the mouth of the Rio Grande, and Boca Chica Beach and Port Isabel, or Point Isabel as it was called at the time, and then Baghdad, which ended up being the major Confederate port on the Mexican side of the river at the time. So this part of the presentation will talk about little known facts about the Rio Grande Valley during the Civil War era, and certain things that we've learned along the way that we feel are important to talk about. So did you know that 53 lieutenants who served in the United States Army against the Mexican Army at the Battle of Palo Alto and also at Fort Brown became generals in the armies of the Union and the Confederacy during the American Civil War? One of which was Ulysses S. Grant, which became the United States 18th President of the United States. But this was a place that was very important to the training of these lieutenants and these officers during the Mexican-American War, where they learned their battle strategies together in the conflict with the country of Mexico. They essentially cut their teeth in, so to speak, in their battle experience. And then later on, 13 years later, they are continuing on in their military service, but yet now they are split, and some of them are in the Union, some of them are in the Confederacy, and they end up fighting against each other. So, like for example, technically there were 6 lieutenants who served at the siege of Fort Brown between May 3rd and May 9th in 1846. So 16 Union lieutenants and 9 Confederate, eventually generals. Of those folks who were fighting together there, 6 of them became Union generals and 9 of them became Confederate generals. And then at the Battle of Palo Alto on May 8th in 1846, 25 of them eventually became Union generals, and 14 of them eventually became Confederate generals within the US Civil War. So this is this region is an important area to note with regard to the training of the major officers in the US Civil War who eventually were fighting against each other. So did you know that Colonel Robert E. Lee, while part of the United States Army, visited Ringgold Barracks, today we know it as Fort Ringgold, in Rio Grande City before the Civil War. So in 1856, he was down in this region working on court-martial sessions at this particular home, or this particular commandant's quarters at Ringgold Barracks. And this particular building was built in 1848. And Fort Ringgold itself right now still stands. There are not many pre-Civil War buildings left except for this one. All the pre-Civil War buildings were built out of wood and have not survived very well. Once the Civil War was over, and then you had the Army of Occupation here with the US colored troops and rebuilding the forts, you started to see the forts being rebuilt with brick and mortar. So this particular home, this commandant's quarters, Robert E. Lee visited before he turned over himself into the Confederate general during the US Civil War. And then the second time Robert E. Lee was at this location was in 1860, when he came down to investigate a Mexican marauder, or depending on what aspect of history you are researching, Juan Cortina was kind of the nemesis of the region, parading up and down the Rio Grande, fighting for the original Mexican land grantees to maintain their lands, which after the Mexican-American War was over and the Rio Grande became the US-Mexico natural international border, a lot of these Mexican land grantee heirs were losing their property. So Robert E. Lee was down here trying to quell Juan Cortina and his armies that were going up and down the river and creating a bit of havoc. So did you know that borderland families were mustering into both the Union and Confederate armies? So this particular region of Texas, with Texas becoming a Confederate state in February of 1861, and then the US Civil War launching in April of 1861, the folks who were living down here were somewhat removed, but still there were events and battles that were occurring throughout that period of time down here. And there were periods of time that the Union actually took control of this particular region because they were trying to stop the trade of cotton and salt and other war material going up and down the international border of the Rio Grande. So you would have, for example, folks who were related to each other in families and whatnot at different times mustering into the Confederacy versus mustering into the Union Army. So on the left of your screen is the registration form or the muster roll for Ramon Salinas, who happens to be related to the person next to him, which is Patricio Perez, and he mustered into the Union 2nd Texas Cavalry. They both lived on ranches along the water, along the Rio Grande. They did not live too far from each other as the crow flies. They were related to each other, and yet at different times during this war, you had folks mustering in along the Rio Grande to the different sides. So, and the other two images on this slide happen to be Union soldiers as well, who had mustered into that 2nd Texas Cavalry Unit. And then there's another one who, there was an independent partisan ranger group down here that was more on the Union side. And then you had Captain Thomas's Company of Partisan Rangers, which was a Confederate Union unit. You also had Trevino's Regiment, which was a partisan ranger Confederate unit that was closer to Cameron County and to the Gulf of Mexico, to the water. So at various times throughout the war, there were different reasons for these folks to be asked to muster in. And they were being offered money. They were being offered a horse or a rifle or a saddle or boots or other items of value in order to entice them to muster in. And in some cases they got them, in some cases they didn't. But the reason they were being recruited to muster in on either side was because they were looking for skilled horsemen to patrol the region. And because most of these folks were ranchers, they were also, going up and down along the river to try to protect their property, keep their cattle on their property, and so forth and so on. So the folks down here weren't necessarily gung-ho for the Union or gung-ho for the Confederacy. They were gung-ho for keeping their property and keeping their possessions and protecting their families. So they were mustering in for those reasons. And then in some cases, when they didn't actually get what was promised to them, then they would simply slip over the Rio Grande into Mexico and stay with family members on the other side of the border until the conflicts subsided. So, did you know that the highest ranking Spanish-speaking officer in the Confederate Army was Santos Benavides of Laredo, who was part of the 33rd Texas Confederate Cavalry. So this region that we live in down here on the US-Mexico border is predominantly Hispanic and Spanish-speaking. So when we do a lot of these presentations all around the region, and we've given them outside of the region as well, we do a lot of focus on the Hispanic culture and Spanish-speaking peoples. So for us in this region, and then for eventually what was very important to the Confederacy during the US Civil War, this was also a very important aspect of the war. So Colonel Santos Benavides had risen through the ranks in the Confederate Army, and eventually he was promoted to colonel and had been given the opportunity to be promoted to general, provided he created large enough of a regiment that would garner him the title, or earn him the title of general. And so he and Colonel John Salmon, aka Rip Ford, both of them were competing for generalship, if you will, with regiments along the Rio Grande. So he did gather up the 33rd Texas Cavalry Benavides Regiment portion of it, because originally it was Colonel Duff's regiment. But he did gather quite a few, I don't remember the exact number that were in his regiment, but he actually never did get promoted to general. But he did serve in the Texas legislature in the House of Representatives for 5 years, and was a very important leader in what we know today as the city of Laredo, Texas. So this particular colonel was a great leader in the region with regard to the Confederacy, and was traveling up and down the Rio Grande on both sides of the border throughout the US Civil War, trying to protect cotton trade and other items of trade that were occurring along the US-Mexico border. And that trade was very valuable to the Confederacy, because that was essentially what was funding the Confederacy at that time. And so eventually in 1864, Colonel Benavides's biggest event was to guard 5,000 bales of cotton in San Agustin Plaza, which is right on the river in Laredo. It's the oldest historic plaza there. It was built when Laredo became a Spanish village in the 1750s. So it's been around for a long time, and Benavides and the other gentlemen that are in the picture here, which are either his half-brothers or brother-in-laws and whatnot, they all lived on that historic plaza. And so they were tasked to protect all of that cotton, because it was being diverted, instead of going straight down along the Gulf of Mexico to the port of Brownsville and out into the Gulf of Mexico, where ships from all over the world were waiting for cotton, to buy cotton. These bales of cotton were diverted to Laredo, to San Agustin Plaza, so that he could get them across the border over there, and that they would travel by mule train down to the port of Baghdad on the Mexican side of the river, right before the Gulf of Mexico. So did you know that just across the Rio Grande, there was a civil war raging between Juarez and Maximilian? So there were civil wars going on south of the border, starting in 1853, and then another one in 1857. But during the US Civil War, this particular civil war in Mexico between the Mexican Republican Army of Benito Juarez and the Mexican Imperial Army of Maximilian, they were fighting between 1862 and 1867. So, you know, there were plenty of conflicts going on south of the river during the US Civil War that were kind of pertinent to what was happening on our side. So, as you might imagine, Benito Juarez and the Mexican Republican Army were more leaning toward or in support of the Union and President Lincoln. I mean, down here we even have a high school called Juarez Lincoln High School. So of course, as the Mexican Republican Army is fighting this imperial invader, Maximilian and the French and the Belgians and the others that were down there, they wanted their friend across the border to be the Union Army, which was you know, a strong army. And then of course the Imperial Army in Mexico, led by Maximilian, was more friendly with the Confederacy, because the Confederacy, or you know, the Confederate States of America, had seceded from the Union, and a divided United States was an easier United States to conquer. And so the Imperial Army of Mexico and the Europeans wanted that division in the United States. So they were sympathetic toward the Confederacy. So you had that going on back and forth over the border, and the different support mechanisms that were happening during that period of time. So even though Mexico is a completely different country, you know, really the river just running through this region is simply a river to be crossed. You know, this is a special and unique place, and it had been, and you know, still is, but back then there was a very common travel across the border or across the river that, you know, was daily occurrences. So did you know that mixed race families settled along the newly formed US-Mexico international border along the Rio Grande prior to the start of the US Civil War? And then there was underground railroad activity happening through these particular mixed race ranches so that fugitive slaves could travel across the river into Mexico, because at the time, Mexico had already abolished slavery. And so these mixed race families were consisted of a white man and his emancipated slave wife, and then their mixed race children. And so in the whole grand scheme of things within this project, this particular subject matter is my particular area of expertise. So I have been giving lectures not only across the Rio Grande Valley about underground railroad activity through South Texas and into Mexico, but I was invited out to California State University at Dominguez Hills in Los Angeles in February to give a talk about this subject. And I was supposed to go to the African American Museum in Dallas in April for a symposium, but that of course got canceled with COVID. But this is a whole nother subject, and I'm only given 45 minutes, and I could talk forever about this. So these particular families, descendants of these families are still around today. And they were, of course, they were not, they were pro-union. They were not for the Confederacy, simply because they were, much of these families were already emancipated slaves. But they found this place right on the Mexican and US border down here in Hidalgo County, Texas, where they could live in peace and harmony with their neighbors. And they just melded right into the community, the Tejano community. Many of the descendants of this family now, these families now have Hispanic last names like Bravo, Ramirez, Falcon, and so they are still here, but they blended into and assimilated into society down here. But one of the interesting things is, and I'll just mention it, when we talked about the Captain Thomas's company of partisan rangers and these different troops that were coming around and wanting people to muster in, there were several members of these ranches that had mustered in to that unit. And it's my belief that they mustered in because they wanted to, you know, the old adage, keep your friends close, but keep your enemies closer. And so during that period of time, there was a lot of slave catching going on. And so in order to protect their loved ones, and then in addition to protect their family, their ranches, their property, they mustered into this unit. And the truth of the matter is the Captain Thomas's Company of Partisan Rangers unit was only an active unit for 4 months. So from December 1862 to March of 1863. So many of the people that mustered into that unit were ranch owners, had property. So these families were definitely part of that. Did you know that African American troops fought at the Battle of Palmito Ranch? And so we had various groups of US colored troops come down here. And Dave had sent me some information with regard to the 41st United States Colored Troop Regiment as well. And, you know, we do have them listed on our website and the different locations that they were at down here, and other regiments as well. I think as time went on, the 25th Corps kind of brought many of the different regiments together to function as one. But these African American troops were here and they fought at the last land battle of the US Civil War at Palmito Ranch. And I'll talk about that in another slide or two. And by the way, when they came into Brazos Santiago Island and were camped close to this Palmito Ranch site, they were definitely in segregated campsites. Like there were definitely those folks were in their own campsites, separate from, you know, the 34th Indiana Volunteers and the other regiments that were down here at the time. Did you know that following the US Civil War, these African American troops stayed behind basically as armies of occupation to rebuild the forts at Fort Brown, Fort Ringgold, and Fort McIntosh, and, you know, Fort Duncan and the other forts along the border. So these are some of the buildings on the different forts that these troops had rebuilt and repaired while they were stationed at these different forts. So here you have the post hospital at Fort Ringgold. You have, I think this is the armory at Fort Brown, and this is, you know, was a commissary building at Fort McIntosh. All right, so here's where I'm going to give you the numeric statistics with regard to money during this period of time. So in 1861, when the Confederacy seceded from the Union, in their treasury, they had $47 million. And at that time, they were considered the 5th wealthiest country in the world, with 47 million in their treasury. So they embark on the secession, and then the US Civil War occurs. So during the US Civil War, cotton trade along the Rio Grande generated over $162 million, and that's in 1860s currency. So translated into today's currency, that's over $2.9 billion. And I think we all can agree that that is quite a lot of money in our terms, in today's money. So imagine that revenue that was being generated by the Confederacy during the US Civil War, during those years. You know, that profit was not funding any battles or any activity that was going on down here. Those profits were funding the Confederacy fighting battles in other places. So this money, or these profits, helped to keep the Confederacy afloat. So one of the things we do talk about when we do talk to other groups is that, you know, what would have happened if the Union had been able to successfully blockade this trade? And so I did a calculation of just 1 year. If the Union would have been able to stop the Confederacy, stop the trade along the Rio Grande 1 year earlier, almost 350,000 lives would not have been lost. So, you know, when I teach history here, when I teach US history here at UTRGV, and I talk about the US Civil War, I tell the students that, you know, there was roughly 600,000 deaths, and then another 400,000 who were maimed or, you know, injured permanently, you know, disabled because of their participation in this war. So imagine just 1 year earlier, over half of those lives would not have been lost if the Union would have been able to blockade the trade along the Rio Grande. And you know, the savvy businessmen down here at the time were running steamboats up and down the river and flying the Mexican flag on their steamboats so that the Union could not board these ships. And because if that was the case and the Union did board the ships, that would have been considered an act of war on Mexico. And that's not something we wanted to do. So these merchants during that period of time knew what to do to circumnavigate all of this so that they could successfully trade their wares, mostly cotton. We call it white gold in our presentations, you know, white gold meaning cotton, but also salt, because we do have a series of salt lakes down here that were also being mined by the Confederacy and used for, you know, trade and to sell and to make money during that period of time. So white gold being cotton and salt. And then there was other war material that was being traded and whatnot, medicine, ammunition, guns, and things like that. So this region of the country, has really not been researched by most Civil War historians, but we wanted to bring all of this to everybody's attention because, really this was the heartbeat of the way that the Confederacy could make money and keep the war going. So we also like to bring to the attention that we had what we call bookend battles down here. So April 12th, 1861, you had the start of the US Civil War at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. But a few days later, we had a battle down here in what's known today as Zapata, Texas. Back then it was known as Carrizo. But there was a battle at Clareño Ranch between Colonel Santos Benavides, representing the Confederacy. Of course, this Juan Cortina got himself involved with the US Civil War, and at times, whichever benefited him the most, he was either on the Union side or on the Confederate side. This particular time, he was on the Union side, as were most people living in Zapata County at the time. They weren't really interested in becoming Confederates when Texas became a Confederate state in February of 1861. So there were issues going on there. And because Benavides and his regiments were the protectors of the cotton trade in the region, they embarked upon this battle. So our first battle of the US Civil War happened down here just a few days after Fort Sumter, which, in all intents and purposes can be considered almost simultaneous. And then the last land battle of the Civil War was fought at Palmito Ranch battlefield between Brownsville, Texas and Boca Chica Beach. So, those who were stationed along Brazos Santiago Island coming in through that port, where those Union forces were moving in toward Brownsville from there. And then the Confederate troops who were guarding, again, bales of cotton at Fort Brown were trying to protect that. Even though the war was over, and I'll get into that in the next slide, they were moving toward what is known today as Palmito Ranch, and that's where that battle ensued. So why did the battle at Palmito Ranch occur after Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse? Well, Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, was refusing to give up, and he fled Richmond. And even after the surrender of Robert E. Lee and the disbanding of the Army of Northern Virginia, Jefferson Davis wanted to flee to Mexico, where he had friends, the Imperial Mexican army and leaders down there. So he wanted to make his way across the river into Mexico so he could regroup, reform, and then re-enter the United States, or re-enter and then start the war all over again. So there were rumors that he was heading to Texas. He wanted to establish a new Confederate capital because, he did leave Richmond and was, conceded in that as well. But Brownsville had 2,000 bales of cotton that they were protecting at Fort Brown. And, they had horses and they had other supplies that they wanted to protect so that they could essentially regroup and reform. So this battle ensues, and it starts on May the 12th, 1865. Jefferson Davis actually gets caught and captured on May the 10th. And so initially, one might think, well, during those years, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have telephones. We didn't have media giving us a play-by-play of every battle. People were not as informed as they are today. And maybe the folks down on the river didn't know the actual war was over, so this battle just ensued. Well, no, that wasn't the case, because the steamships were still going up and down the Rio Grande. They were coming in from New Orleans, and they were delivering newspapers off these ships that made the big announcement, the war is over. So they knew. The people down here knew. Yet the battle ensued, and the battle, this particular battle happened because the Confederates were trying to protect what was left of what they had to sell so that they could regroup and reform. And the Union was sent there to squash that. So maybe May the 10th to May the 12th was not enough time to get a telegram or something to say, hey, the war's over. But, and then even the Battle of Palmito Ranch was a Confederate victory. But then it didn't matter, because Jefferson Davis was caught, and then it was really, then it was winding down. So let's see. So then we did all of this research. We put this all together in a book. But we've also created the Rio Grande Valley Civil War Trail, which consists of a tourism guide map and a website, traveling museum exhibits, and all kinds of things. And this is an example of our map, or this is our map. I sent a little goodie bag to Dave after he asked me to talk with you guys tonight. He did share, I think he scanned some of the postcards we have in there. And before I forget, if any of you want a little goodie bag, I can mail it to you. So if you would just provide Dave your name and address, he can send me a list of who wants one. In the bag is, the map, the postcards, a pen, a Post-it note, some swag and giveaway stuff that when we do community engagement events, wherever we are, we give these out to the people who come to visit us. So this is essentially our map. And so as you can see, Laredo's way up here. And then this is a 200-mile trail all the way to the opening in the mouth of the Rio Grande. So these are the different sites along the way. And we have a mobile web, and then our website. If you wanted to surf that, you could read or listen to audio podcasts of every single site, battle, person, point of interest that we have on our trail. So I feel like I've been talking for almost an hour, at least 45 or 50 minutes. So I think this is my second to last slide. These are 3 books that we've published. This Civil War on the Rio Grande is what Dave and your group had asked me to talk about today. And so this is that scholarly anthology collection of essays. It's a very heavy read, but it's very good. Very comprehensive. The blue and gray on the border is essentially our tourism guidebook. So if you were to come to the Rio Grande Valley of Texas and want to drive the trail, you might want to buy this book, and it's going to give you, a brief history of the 5-county region, of each different county, what sites are in each different county, what places you can go visit, the phone numbers, the addresses, their hours of operation. It's a tourism guidebook, lots of pictures, but lots of good history pulled from this book in a more, travel and tourism sense. And then this is the last book over here is our brief history. We call it our popular book. It's a 78-page book written on a 7th or 8th grade, like a middle school level, because we do a lot of K through 12 education with this project. And it's a very easy read, but very comprehensive. And so these are books that we have published with regard to this project. And okay, so that's my last slide. And I'm opening it up for questions. So does anybody have any questions?
Thank you very much, Roseann. That was excellent presentation.
Thank you.
As I'm unmuting folks, I have a question for you. Were there any direct confrontations with the French, with either the Union or, for that matter, Confederate forces in the region? Roseann?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I may have been muted.
Oh.
Were there any direct confrontations with the French and Union or Confederate forces in the region?
Not that I'm aware of. I know that there were communications and support between certain groups, but no, not that I'm aware of.
Okay. And one other question. I think most of us are familiar with USCT experiences in the war, and also to a certain extent with the Native American experiences. But regarding the Tejanos, can you talk a little bit more about their experiences? I mean, you touched on a little bit about with the mixed families, but how did this all? Well, first of all, who are the Tejanos, and how did the war affect them specifically?
Well, in this particular region, you would call a Hispanic person who is a descendant of the original Spanish land grantees. You would either call them Mexican Texans, you'd call them Tejanos. When we say Tejanos, we're typically referring to ranching and farming families that have been around for, well, since the Spaniards settled the region in the 1740s and 1750s. So when you talk to somebody from here who is a descendant of those, one of those families, and there's a lot of them that are here, they'll say the border crossed over them, that they didn't cross the border crossed over them. They've been living here. Their families have been residing here, since the 1740s and 50s. But because of the Mexican-American War and in 1848, the establishment of the international border being the Rio Grande, so there's that, it's a group of people who feel very passionate about their land ownership. And so, like I was saying, with regard to the different regiments that were coming through and trying to get these the Tejanos to muster in, they found themselves involved in the U.S. Civil War and not really necessarily wanting to be a part of it. They were living there when the international border became the border. They're still, even today, a lot of these families still speak Spanish first in the home and then English second, and still cater to their culture. So these Tejanos were very interested in keeping their land. They had already fought to keep their land once the border became the border, and then the land on the north side of the border was subject to taxes by the US government. A lot of those folks didn't know and understand what that meant. And so years and years go by, and these folks, first they had to prove that they owned the land. And they did. Many of them did successfully. Some of them just fled back over the border into Mexico and never came back. But those who did, through the Borland Miller group, came and they were able to prove that they owned the land, and then didn't know they had to pay taxes. So then they were about to lose their land because they hadn't paid taxes. And a lot of them ended up losing their land later because they had to hire a lawyer to represent them so that they could keep their land. But the only way they could pay them was giving the lawyers a piece of their land. So a lot of these Tejanos, were losing land right and left. And those who were fighting in the US Civil War here really were concerned about keeping their lifestyle, their livelihood, their land, their property, and their families safe. And so because the region, the Confederacy and the Union kind of changed hands several times down here during that period of time, it really didn't matter to them which side they were on. They just wanted to protect what was theirs.
Okay. Other questions for Roseann tonight?
I have a question. It's kind of a two-parter. Regarding the, this tremendous amount of cotton trade across the border. Number one, where was that cotton grown? Was it grown in Texas, or did it come from the East? And number two, after the fall of Vicksburg in July 1863, basically the Trans-Mississippi was cut off. So how did that revenue get back to the Confederacy?
It wasn't cut off down here. Not at all. How did it okay, so there was cotton trade happening, in northern Texas near the Louisiana border. There's a lot of cotton plantations up there. For them, it's a faster route to get their cotton to market by just going straight down the Gulf Coast to the port of Brownsville. And so in 1863, when the Union made a big surge and were trying to blockade all the ports along the Texas coast, Galveston, Corpus Christi, and Brownsville, that's when they were diverting the cotton trains, the wagon trains, to go out to Laredo. And then Benavides would assist in getting that cotton across the river at Laredo. And then they would travel by ox cart or wagon down the Rio Grande to Baghdad, which was on the southern side of the river, or they would get on now granted, the river boats or the steamships didn't always get up to Laredo because of the depth of the Rio Grande at certain times. So it wasn't often that the steamships would get all the way up there, but they would get as far up as Roma often without a problem. And so, Benavides would have the cotton cross the river at Laredo, travel down by ox cart, perhaps get on a steamboat in Roma that was that had a Mexican flag flying in its mast, but being, steamship captain of Mifflin Kennedy or Charles Stillman or Richard King. These were pretty big entrepreneurs down here, which, you know, Russ and Chris call them, what do they call them? War profiteers or merchants of death. You know, these these steamship captains, but they, you know, so they were smart. So they got the cotton to market on these steamships flying the Mexican flag. So they were able to continue this trade. It was diverted, it was a little convoluted, but they still were able to continue the trade.
So the cotton was grown in Texas, and you explained how it got to market.
Yeah.
But how did how did any of that money get back to Richmond to fund the Confederate war effort?
Well, there were ships waiting out in the Gulf of Mexico for the cotton, and so were you know, Confederate runners. You know, you had blockade runners. You had you know, all kinds of different people who were getting that trade back to probably through New Orleans, perhaps. You know, they were getting that money back to the Confederacy, back to the Confederate Treasury.
All right, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Dave, I have a question. I read an article a few years ago in America's Civil War about the Battle of Palmito Ranch, and it was the author's contention that there's a truce had been worked out between the two sides down in Brownsville area, and they knew the war was coming to an end, but the Union commander had not yet been involved in battle, and he basically wanted to get his battle spurs before the war ended, so he provoked a battle that was really not necessary.
Yeah, yeah. That most likely is the case. Barrett, right? Theodore Barrett. Yeah, that could be the case, but you know, there's also another underlying story. Apparently Benavides's regiment was there, but Colonel Benavides wasn't there. Rip Ford was the commanding colonel for the Confederacy at Palmito Ranch. And so like I had said earlier, Colonel Benavides really wanted to become a general, and he was tasked to build a regiment big enough to garner him the title of general. And then, of course, battles. But I do believe that he, and I have to look a little bit further into this, but I have come across some information that he and Colonel Rip Ford were kind of vying for the same generalship, you know. So that battle probably wasn't thought of as, you know, or that battle happening really was probably more exciting to both sides for different reasons, you know, that getting you know, more fame under their belt by, you know, winning a battle. Well, of course, Barrett didn't win that battle. The Confederacy won that battle. So yes, that is something that is often talked about. Did it really need to happen? So.
Other questions?
No more.
Just on the subject of Palmito Ranch. So the Confederacy won, but what happened next? They just went home?
Oh, wow. Well, in some cases, because of the Tejano soldiers that were fighting in these in the regiments, like the 33rd Texas Cavalry was there, but they were all out of Laredo. So yes, they went and traveled, and that's 200 miles upriver. It's a long way to go, you know. And then the different regiments that were there, the ones that were the U.S. colored troops, were staying behind to help rebuild the different forts along the river.
We have a question about how can the books be purchased?
Well, I have, let's see, I had the QR codes there. If you wanted to scan the QR code, it'll take you right to the purchase of it. But the Civil War in the Rio Grande and Blue and Gray on the Border are both published by Texas A&M Press. So you could either go to the Texas A&M Press website. They have them in Amazon and Barnes & Noble. The Civil War on the Rio Grande, this one, they sold out of the hardcover books. And I was trying to make sure that they were going to get their order of the soft covered books in by today. But I think they're going to be coming in closer to the middle or to the end of the month. I believe various outlets still have this one, but this one is out of stock right now, and in hardcover, I don't even know if they're going to order it anymore in hardcover, so it's going to be soft cover. And then this one, the Civil War in the Lower Rio Grande, this one's $9.99, and it's published by lulu.com. So we wrote the book and we self-published this book. So it's available at a publisher called lulu.com, LULU.com, and it's $9.99. And you can just go on to their site and order it there. The Civil War in the Rio Grande is $45. Well, the hardcover was $45. I don't know what the soft cover is going to be. And then this one in Blue and Gray on the Border is a soft cover book, and it's $28.
Okay, any other questions for Roseann? Okay,
Yeah.
Rich.
Excuse me.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
How do we
No.
how do we get the information again? I mean, the souvenirs, the postcards, the touristy information that Roseann's offering.
Send your name and address, your mailing address to me, Dave. Just reply to the invitation I sent you.
Dave who?
Dave Wilson.
Just reply to the invitation I sent you for the Zoom meeting
Oh, okay.
with your name and address.
Okay.
And I'll compile those and forward them to you, Roseann.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Did you enjoy it, Bernice?
Oh, it was excellent. This was superb.
Okay. All right, good.
Close. Roseann, you did a wonderful job.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
This is magnificent.
Thank you. I wish I knew more about these, but this is a
Wait, don't go away. All right, one quick question. Is BCIU 9 still with us? Okay, I guess not. All right, now comes the fun part. Thank you so much for a great presentation. First, we have some things to remember your visit to Old Baldy. You can see this. This is a certificate. Does that show up?
Roseann, can you stop sharing your screen?
Yes, yes.
And then we can see the gallery view.
All right, let me push. Oh, stop share. Okay. There we go.
Oh,
Right, next.